So you like how I'm dressed?
Love it.
All right? Now, I want you to take note. I have beige pants and a blue sweater. Tim, he's got a beige sweater and blue pants. That's because every time I go to my closet and say, what should I wear? I think, what would Tim wear? So I was a little bit off today, but he's an inspiration. I was saying to Janet the other day at the celebration service, I said, I went to my closet and I said, would Tim wear this? Hey, I don't know if you have all heard, and if you haven't, Google it. And in fact, I don't even think you have to Google it anymore. It's starting to spread. There is a revival that broke out in Asbury University, UC Asbury Theological University. And it was started by the students, I believe, on February 8th. They had a normal chapel like they usually do, 3 days a week, 3 mornings a week, an hour each morning. And they said a young man got up, and as he got up, he just confessed all his failures. He just poured himself out, and the service has not stopped. They say that people are coming from all over the world to experience this, as they call it, revival. Other universities have now sent people down. They're starting the same thing in other universities. Now, I want to stress, these are kids in their late teens, early 20s that have started this, and there's no other word to explain it than the Spirit has laid His hand on them. And these are young kids that are completely and totally submerging themselves in this. And others are stopping to watch, others that are much older than them, coming to investigate. I was surprised. Tucker Carlson had it on. He interviewed the president of the student body. He said, can you explain this? She says, I have no explanation. And he says, when is this going to end? She goes, I have no idea. And I've seen, slowly but surely, I'm seeing it start to be brought, because you cannot not report on this, because it's happening and it's taking place. And so to me, in the midst of what we think is so bad, God's still here. He's still working. And even it might be under the covers and we don't see it, He's still working. There are a lot of cultures and religions that have specific rites of passage or ceremonies that they give to young people to celebrate their becoming of a man or a woman. One Native American group in Nova Scotia, Canada, they have this long-standing tradition, and each young boy is sent to live in the wilderness by himself for a week. And it was the rite of passage, I don't know if they still do it, for a male child to live in the wilderness for a week before he was given the right to marriage and have his own family. He had to survive the forest. He was given a bow, some bread, and a mat for his travels, and he was not to return to the base camp for a week. And during that time, he had to hunt, he had to provide for himself, he had to sustain himself. And the trip was more than just a test of courage and skill. It was a spiritual journey, too. On this journey, a young boy was to discover his true manhood. And the test wasn't to destroy the boy, it was to build his confidence and his ability to manage the difficulties of life. Well, sometimes God commands us to leave the camp. And God, instead of protecting us from all life's harms, He pushes us out the door to fight for ourselves. Instead of providing another better job, He tells us to deal with the one we already have. Instead of delivering us from sickness, He tells us to be patient with us. And maybe He teaches us how to be long-suffering in it. Instead of saving us from difficult people, He tests us by using them. He builds our perseverance by encouraging us not to give up. Instead of providing a child, He tells us, now I'm all you need. Instead of rescuing us from life's problems, life's difficulties, he sometimes just walks by and watches us struggle. Sometimes God forces us out of the house to encounter life's pain. Now, this is not the typical image of God portrayed in the Christian world. People don't like hearing about a non-anxious God. A God that's more concerned about your faith development than your physical and emotional comfort. A God that's willing to let you deal with the difficulties of life on your own. A God who sends you into a storm instead of out of it and is willing to leave you there. That's not a popular God. A while back, I watched a good movie. I loved it. I liked it, was encouraged by it. It was called Facing the Giants. And it was about a football coach who was having a losing season. The parents were turning against him. They were fighting to get him fired. He was dealing with money problems. His wife couldn't get pregnant. It was his fault. The whole world seemed to be turning against him. And as the movie continued, he decided to give God all the honor in all he did. And he started to teach that to his players. And the movie begins to unfold in a totally different direction. The team turns around. He's given a large raise and a new truck. His football team ends up winning the state title against overwhelming odds. At the end of the movie, his wife gets pregnant. It seemed that as soon as he gave God the glory, his whole life changed directions. And the movie portrayed God in a certain way, kind of like just believe and you receive. And we like this God. We like this comfort. We like this friend. But life doesn't always paint that kind of picture. God does not always rescue the suffering and save the oppressed, at least physically. Sometimes God leaves us in the midst of it. Sometimes he allows us to struggle with doubt and with uncertainty. And God has no intentions of bailing us out, but getting us through. Sometimes he calms the storms, other times he calms his child. And this is the case of Matthew chapter 6, verses 45 to 52. It's interesting, in this particular version of the story, I shouldn't say version, or interpretation, however you want to put it, it's Mark that's helping write it with the help of Peter. And it's interesting, too, that he leaves out the story of Peter walking on the water in this particular passage, which is found in the other Gospels. And I wonder, why did Mark and Peter leave that out? I wonder, maybe that's not the point of the story. This is the account of Jesus walking on the water. We love to hear this story as a promise that God is going to help us in the storms of life. We love to know that Jesus came to his disciples and he stilled the storm, just like he did a couple chapters back in Mark. But this story is not about the comfort that Jesus brings. Mark pictures this account almost as a rebuke to the disciples. He pictures Jesus not as the great rescuer from our fears, but almost as if he was the cause of our fear. And Jesus is even willing to allow them to remain afraid. With the sea and the waves raging about them, they're struggling at the oars. And Jesus is intending to walk right by them. Jesus doesn't seem to be concerned about relieving their anxiety. Not that Jesus would normally hear about, is it? Let me read Matthew chapter 6, verse 45 to 52. Now let's remember, this is right after he fed the 5,000 men and who knows how many children and women. A miracle beyond miracles, right? Okay. And immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side to Bethesda, while he himself was sending the multitude away. After bidding them farewell, he departed to a mountain to pray. And when it was evening, the boat was in the midst of the sea, and he was alone on the land. And seeing them straining at the oars, for the wind was against them, at about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea, and he intended to pass them by. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed that it was a ghost, and they cried out, for they all saw him and were frightened. But immediately he spoke with them and said to them, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." And he got into the boat with them, and the wind stopped, and they were greatly astonished, for they had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. They were forced into uncomfortableness and uncertainty. Sound familiar? The story begins with a feeding of 5,000 ends. Jesus has just fed this multitude before the eyes of the disciple, a miracle beyond miracles. And after the people were fed, he told the disciples to go out with baskets that they previously didn't have. Suddenly they had them. And they collected not one, but 12. It's interesting, 12 baskets full of scraps of fish and bread, and 12 disciples. And then they sat down, and Jesus taught them. And certainly that was enough to supply for their needs and their munchies while Jesus spoke. And as Mark does on numerous occasions, he continues the journey with another journey immediately. This time, Jesus is making his disciples get into the boat and cross the sea to travel Bethesda. Now, the word "make" there is very interesting. The term "made," he made his disciples get into the boat, can be rendered forced or compelled. So it wasn't like, "Hey, why don't you guys go and get into the boat?" No, it was, "You all get in the boat, go to the other side." He commanded them. He forced them. Jesus is commanding the disciples to travel into the sea alone at night because it was evening. Now, this would have been a scary thought for those that were not normally fishing, especially for anyone that knew the dangers of traveling the sea at night in strong waves. And maybe there was not any wind or waves when Jesus made them get into the boat. We don't know. But it's dangerous even for those that knew the sea well. And in ancient times, there were superstitions about the sea at night. And those stories spread. It was a place where there was evil, where there were monsters. Now, these guys had to fish often at night, so they had a certain level of understanding about the sea at night. And the enemy of our souls is very, very smart, and so he's going to take any opportunity he can to knock us down when he gets a foothold. And I'm sure with some of these guys that knew these ancient stories and traditions were afraid. And the enemy was encouraging that. And I knew that. We know that because it says that they were frightened when they thought Jesus was a ghost. They were believing all the stories. But traveling the sea at night was and is an intimidating experience. I don't care who you are. Jesus sends his disciples, makes them go into this level of uncertainty and uncomfortableness. I thought about that when Pete said that with Chris gone, he's into this uncomfortable place. Jesus sends his disciples out alone at night to cross the rough sea, and he knew it was going to get rough because it's God. Sometimes God forces us out of a safe route and into a dangerous one. Why would he do that? We like the easy path. We enjoy the comfortable trail. God sometimes commands us into uncertain territory. God sometimes forces his people into talking about him and his word in front of people that mock the words that are coming out of your mouth. Why does he do that? God has called us to more than baking casseroles and writing nice cards and visiting the sick. Those are all very good things. But sometimes he sends us out into the sea where there's real danger. We like to stay close to shore. We like to feel that we're giving the Lord our best. We like to do the easy stuff, and sometimes we make excuses for the difficult tasks. But the same God that sent the disciples into the dangerous sea is also sending us into places that are uncomfortable and uncertain. And there's a reason behind all of that. Secondly, we see that they're forced into fear and anxiety. The disciples are abandoned to this rough sea alone, and Jesus is alone on the mountain praying. Now here's the interesting thing with the story. Jesus is well aware that they're straining at the oars, that the wind is picked up, that the waves were big. He's watching them. And instead of rushing out to save them, he goes up onto the mountain alone to pray. Jesus is calmly praying by himself. Jesus is even watching them struggle to fight the sea. And they're struggling and they're gaining no ground. And this is an intimidating experience. And the disciples needed help. And Jesus is just standing there watching them struggle. I mean, if this were a movie, you'd be sitting there, go, Jesus, help them, help them. But he doesn't. He's calmly watching them. No movement to save them from their struggle. No immediate relief from their anxiety. And I don't know how many of you have been on a body of water and felt helpless. I was out on the Hudson River one day. This was years ago. I moved over here from Rockland County, and one of the first things I did is I had a guy that offered me a boat, a 16-foot boat, which is not very big, and with a 25 horsepower motor. I thought I was something. So I said, I'm going out on the Hudson River, I'm going to go start fishing. And I had always fished from the shore, so I took this boat out, and I was in Haverstraw, Croton Bay there, and the wind started to kick up, and the wind was getting pretty good. Those of you that know the river know that when the wind kicks up, the waves out there get almost ocean-like. Mm-hmm. And I'm out there in this 25 horsepower motor, and I have this baby full throttle because I got to get back to the dock where I launched the boat. And I'm out in the middle of Haverstraw Bay, and I'm full throttle with this 25 horsepower motor, and I'm looking at the shoreline, and I'm not gaining any ground. In fact, what I find is that I'm getting pushed back by the wind and the current of the water which is going out. So I'm scared. I didn't say it, but I was scared. And I tried, and I tried, and I tried, and I kept that, and then I'm thinking, I don't know what I'm gonna do here. I'm gonna be down in New York City by the time so I just headed for the shoreline. I turned the boat around, went with the current and the wind, and I headed toward the shoreline. When I got to the shoreline, I stopped several feet out, and I just slowly made my way back to where I needed to go along the shoreline. And eventually the wind died down. Now that was during the daylight. I can't imagine what has been for those disciples at night. There was one time I did encounter a night thing like that. I went out one night, this is after I got a big boat. It was about an 18-foot boat, had a big, hefty 40 horsepower motor. And so I went out on this nice summer evening, and it was about 6 p.m., and I said, I'm going fishing. So I went out into Peekskill Bay, and I went out toward the Bear Mountain Bridge, and I was in the bay way over there. I could see the Peekskill Marina, and I could see the Bear Mountain Bridge. So I threw my anchor down, I started to fish, and I fished for a couple hours, and it was, 9 o'clock, somewhere around there. And so I said, time to go home before it gets too dark. And so I went to start my boat. It wouldn't start. I tried, and I tried, and I tried. And it wouldn't start. I took the engine cover over. I started to play with the engine. I say play with because I really didn't know what I was doing. And yeah, you just kind of, that's what we guys do sometimes. We just kind of play with it. It makes us feel good, and it makes people think that we know what we're doing. And so I'm trying to get this motor started. Everything I tried, nothing was working, and it was dead as a doornail. So I know, I had my cell phone. I get on the phone, I'll call my buddies who have boats. Well, it was toward the end of the summer, and those buddies that I called that were around and picked up their phone, they couldn't help me out. The one guy that I was counting on, he said, Dave, he goes, my boat's out of the water. So I'm stuck. And it was pitch black out. It was 10:30, moving toward 11. So I called Seatow. Some of you know Seatow, they're like AAA on the river. And they said, okay, we're gonna leave in a few minutes and we'll come up to get you. They have to come up the river from downriver. It took them 3 hours to reach me. When they finally reached me, they hooked me up. And the whole time I could see Peekskill Bay. And the whole time I was starting to get afraid, not just because of the hour of the night, but I'm thinking, Lord, please don't let the wind kick up. Unfortunately, it didn't. So at 2 a.m. when I finally made it back to the marina, $400 later, I was safe and sound. But I could not imagine what it must have been like at night. I had another incident down in, I'm always with boats. I was down in Cozumel with my wife and another friend and his wife, and the girls were best friends. And so we were getting ready to fly from Cozumel back home. And John and I looked at each other and we said, hey, let's take one more sail. Well, actually, I kind of said, let's go one more little boat ride. So we'll take this little sunfish and we'll go out into the ocean. And then we'll come back. And we'll get packed and get to the airport. And John, okay, let's do this. And so we got on the sailboat, we went out, and I was good. I was pretty confident in my abilities as a seaman. I'd spent a lot of time on Hudson. I was forgetting this wasn't Hudson. And so I'm tacking back and forth, and we're going out and out. And pretty soon, land is pretty far away. And so I thought, okay, we need to turn around. And so as I tacked to go around, I couldn't catch the wind again. We were sitting there. Finally, I caught some wind. But unfortunately, as I caught some wind, we made a quick turn, and John slipped off the back of the boat. I had a life preserver on, and I thought for a moment, let me go back, and I'll come back and get him, because I don't know if I could. That was a short-lived thought. I went back and got him. I didn't leave him there. But it did occur to me, I can't lie. And so I picked John up, and we get there, and we knew that we were in big trouble. Now, somebody on the shore had the sense to see that we were in desperate trouble and went and talked with the boat. Okay, it was our wives who knew that the idiots were in trouble. And so they went to the guys that were in charge of the boat, and these guys in Cozumel immediately dropped everything, got in the rescue boat, came out, got us, pulled us back, had a few choice words for us, thought you knew how to sail, and also, and we made it. But I was scared. So I don't know how these disciples may have felt. But Jesus doesn't run out like these guys in Cozumel did or Seatow did when I was on Hudson. He watches from a distance to see the disciples and how they would react. In fact, instead of saving the disciples from frightened fear, he intends to walk by them. I don't get that. He didn't seem to have any intention of stopping to assist these guys. The text says that he intended to pass them by. That's in verse 38. Jesus is not going to stop and relieve these guys of their anxiety. He's just going to let them deal with the situation. Does he know they're afraid? Of course it does. The disciples need help, and Jesus is just going to walk by them. That I don't get. This is not the Jesus we like. We like the Jesus who's going to solve our problems. We like the Jesus that's going to take away my fear. I want the Jesus who's going to relieve me of my doubts. We don't want to struggle with doubt. We don't want to struggle with uncertainty. We don't want to struggle with fear. Who wants that? We want Jesus to solve our problems and to make the anxiety go away. Peter Stenke, an author, professor, and pastor, has since gone on to be with the Lord, but he said this. He goes, under pressure, people demand answers and assurances. Their expectation is that leaders will bring them stability, provide safety, and offer quick solutions. There is the expectation that the leader will do all of this with a minimum of disruption and no surprises. People wanted Jesus to deal with everything, to fix everything, to relieve the pressure. And when he doesn't, we struggle with fear and anxiety. And thirdly, they're forced into faith. In verse 49, the disciples think that Jesus is a ghost. They were scared. They were frightened. But Jesus, having compassion on their weakness, he comes to them and he tells them in verse 50, he goes, take courage, it is I. Now when he says, it is I, he is literally saying the same thing as I am. And this is the name of God. We see that in Exodus chapter 3, verse 14. When Moses was questioning the Lord and he said, tell them I am sent you. He's assuring the disciples in that simple statement that God is in their midst, that they don't have to be afraid because God is with them. In fact, God has been with them the whole time. Mark provides us a glimpse into the purpose of this whole passage, of this account. In verse 52, he says, they'd not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. The disciples didn't learn the lesson from the feeding of the 5,000. So what was the lesson? It was a lesson about faith. Look at Mark 6:37. It says, but he answered and said to them, you give them something to eat. This is he feeding the 5,000. They come, 5,000 people sitting out there, probably more like 10,000. They don't have anything to eat. So, Jesus, what are we going to do? It's getting late. And he goes, will you feed them? What? With us? Are you kidding me? And they said to him, shall we go and spend 200 denarii in bread and give them something to eat? And Jesus tells the disciples to handle the problem of feeding the people. But the disciples were thinking through the flesh, not through the spirit. Just like Jesus said long ago, and we have in Matthew 17:20, he said, because of the littleness of your faith, for truly I say to you, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you shall say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it shall move, and nothing shall be impossible for you. The power was in the disciples already. They just had to trust that God would deliver them. Until they did all that they could do. You know, they missed the lesson on faith again that I hope we grab hold of. Yeah, one time there was I didn't intend to tell the story, so I'll kind of give you the quick version. It's a book that I wrote. It's actually based on a story that has been put into books, and about the eagle that thought he was a chicken. In my story, there was an eagle's nest on the top of a tree, and miraculously one of the eggs fell down through the nest, and it rolled down it fell down into an eagle pile and didn't break, and it slowly rolled down the hill and plopped right into a chicken's nest. And that mother hen came over and she saw that egg, and it was big and it was huge, but she was a good mother. She sat on that egg, and the other chicks hatched, the big one wasn't, so she kept on it, and then suddenly it hatched, and out came this ugly looking thing. But she, being a good mother, loved this little eagle. And so all the time when the other chicks bopped and clucked down the road and pecked at the food, this poor eagle would try to bop and cluck and fall over his big feet and roll down and try to grab some food, and he would get a mouthful of dirt because his beak was shaped in such a weird style. And when they played games with the other chickens, they wouldn't let this poor eagle play. Because you see, he would stretch out his wings every once in a while and knock everybody over. The other mothers were scared. It's going to hurt my kid. He can't play. And so he's sitting on the side, very depressed, and suddenly another eagle comes down and lands next to him and looks over with this, well, eagles always have the same face. And he says, "What are you doing here?" And then he looks at this guy and says, "You should be there." And the eagle looked at him and says, "Well, I'm just a chicken. Chickens don't fly." He says, "Look at you. You're an eagle. Be what you were created to be. Stop acting like a chicken."
Amen.
Sometimes we do that. And I think that was why the disciples missed the lesson. Many Christians today, they see that God, he's way out there, he's beyond this world, and we need God to come into here, into our world, to break into our world now and deliver us. But the presence of the Lord is all around us. And it always has been. And the disciples should have trusted in God's power when they were straining at the oars. God did not have to get into the boat with them to deliver them. Jesus has the power to deliver no matter where we are, no matter what we're in the midst of. Remember the centurion in Matthew chapter 8 and also in Luke chapter 7? He asked Jesus to go and heal his servant who he loved. And he told Jesus that he didn't have to worry about going to his house because he understood authority. And I understand authority, Jesus, and if you say, "Be healed," that man will be healed. And Jesus healed the servant, yes. And he turned to the crowd and he said, "Never before have I seen faith like this in all of Israel." Why? That man got it. He understood Jesus' power and authority. Jesus didn't need to be in his boat to stop the waves. But God is never out there. He's in here. We just sang about it. He's around us. He's working in us and through us, whether we know it or not. Even after we're gone. He still is using us and the good works that we've done to impact other people. And isn't that what he said to us? He said, I'm going to go, but I'm going to leave you a deposit guaranteeing your inheritance, and that is the Holy Spirit living in you, not out there. We have everything we need to live through difficult times. Not necessarily out of difficult times. Although he does that for us at moments as well. And at moments he gives us, at those times he gives us all that is necessary to live through the storms. Sometimes we want out of a tough situation. Maybe it's financial, maybe it's health-wise, maybe it's work-related, maybe it's a social situation, maybe it's a relationship that's tough and you want to be done with it, but God says, no, you need to stick in there, to stay in there and work through it. Sometimes God allows us to remain in pain and suffering. He lets us go through seasons of doubt, not to destroy us, but to make us stronger. We grow in faith during the difficult times. What's the old saying? Whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Jesus knows that the faith of his people need to be strengthened, and this doesn't happen without difficult times or without doubting. I always pray on my way here and say, Lord, I just hope these are the right words. And God continually, just as somebody stand up here and share, and I'm thinking, or with the songs. And Tim pretty much could have given my sermon this morning. He had no idea what I was talking about. That's God. That was outside. That was a tangent right there. You know, everyone knows that this is true. Everyone knows it is physically. Everyone knows that if you want to be a good athlete at your craft, you need to train and you need to practice. And we do that by pushing ourselves to the limit in order to build strength and skill and stamina. We all know that we will never excel in athletics, even when we have natural born talent, unless we give it all we got. Fear can also lead us into a deeper walk with God. Proverbs 1:7 says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Sometimes God has to stay on the shore so that his people can develop faith in the midst of trouble. Fred Craddock, another pastor and professor, he tells a story of how he got acquainted with, in New York City, with a minister who had no arms. He was born with no arms, and as he was telling Fred about his life one day, he spoke of experience that he had of putting on his own clothes with no arms. And he said to his mother, who always dressed him, and he'd gotten to be a pretty big boy at this point, she fed him, she dressed him, she cleaned him, she dressed him again, and one day she put the clothes in the middle of the floor, and she said to him, dress yourself. And he said, I can't dress myself. Mama, I got no arms. And she said, you'll have to dress yourself. And then she left the room. And he said, I kicked and I screamed and I kicked and I screamed some more. And then I yelled, you don't even love me anymore, to my mom. And finally, I realized that if I was going to get any clothes on, I'd have to get the clothes on myself. So after hours of struggle, I got some clothes on. And he said it wasn't until later that I found out my mother was in the next room crying. You know, sometimes God is in the next room crying with us, but he's going to leave us alone so we can put our faith on. He did the roughest part for us already. He went to the cross. But more than that, he promises to be with us and to comfort us and to be for us, there for us in times of need. In times when we can't give anything else because we gave all we got. He said he's never going to leave us or forsake us. But he also loves us enough to build up our faith, to strengthen our faith. And he knows the only way is to let us struggle. That mom never left. She was in the next room. She was caring. She was attentive. Just like Jesus was watching the disciples struggle from a distance. He never left them. He was teaching them. And some lessons that are hard for us to learn. But God is patient, and he told us he will never give us more than we can handle. Listen, but how do we know how much we can handle until we give it all we got? And then leave what we don't got up to him. He's watching, and he's attentive, but unlike the mother, he knows when we're at our limit. And that's when he's going to get in the boat. And that's when he's going to remind us that he's been there the whole time. And that's why we celebrate the cross each and every week. Because we so easily forget, especially during rough times. And he wants to remind us who he is, what he's about, and how much he loves us. And like a loving parent, he's letting us struggle because he knows that's going to build us up. And without faith, it is impossible to please God. And that's where faith meets the road. When we're going through those rough times, but we still strain at the oars and saying, Jesus, when you're ready to step in, but I'm going to give it all I got. How cool is that? When we're done, when our strength is out, he's going to step in. He's here. He's watching, and he's reminding us through this story, don't miss the lesson. I want to build your faith, and I will come through on my promises in the Word. Every time you see the cross, remember me. Trust that I'm there. Trust that I'm bringing you through a lesson that is so needed and is going to build your faith. And that is a powerful thing. Because you'll be able to say to a mountain, move, and it will get up and dance to where you want it to go. As we share community with each other, let's remember, as we're going through the rough times, keep giving it all you got. Keep straightening at yours. He knows when you're done. He'll come when you're done, but in the meantime, he just wants to teach us.